Under the wide Texas sky, where the wind carried the scent of dust and mesquite, the Carter Ranch stretched for miles beyond the eye could see. It was the kind of land that made a man quiet, humbled by how small he truly was against all that open space. Out here, the days burned golden and the nights whispered secrets only the stars could keep. That's where our story begins, with a woman who came not looking for love, but for a way to survive. Her name was Emily Dawson. She'd lost more than most folks her age. Life had taken her father first, a kind man who taught her how to mend fences and read the sky for storms. Then, a bad drought swept through their small town, taking their farm and leaving her with debts she couldn't pay. With nowhere else to turn, she packed her few things, left a note on the kitchen table of the only home she'd ever known, and rode a dusty bus headed west. Word was, a ranch out near Red Bluff was hiring hands for the season. She didn't care what the work was, anything that'd keep her moving forward. When she stepped off that bus, the late afternoon sun painted everything in gold, and the air shimmered with heat. She hitched a ride with an old farmer who pointed her toward Carter Ranch. Said the owner, Daniel Carter, was a fair man, tough but honest. Folks said he'd been running the ranch alone since his father passed, and that loneliness had made him quiet as stone. When Emily arrived, she found the ranch just as the story said, vast, worn by weather and time, but standing proud. Fences stretched like veins across the land. Horses grazed lazily by the creek. She stood at the wooden gate for a long while, the wind tugging at her hair, wondering if she was making another mistake. Then she saw him. Daniel Carter rode up from the lower pasture, his horse kicking up soft dust behind him. He was broad-shouldered, sun-tanned, and had the kind of steady eyes that didn't miss much. He stopped a few feet away, dismounted, and wiped the sweat from his brow. Emily introduced herself, said she was looking for work, cleaning, cooking, anything the ranch might need. Daniel looked her over, not in judgment, but like a man measuring if life had tested her the way it had tested him. He nodded once, said, "We always need an extra hand." The days that followed were long. Emily rose before dawn, helping in the kitchen, feeding the horses, mending worn tack. The ranch hands were polite, but kept to themselves. She learned to keep her head down, but her eyes wandered, especially toward Daniel. He worked harder than any of them, barely spoke unless it was about the land. He'd lost his wife 3 years ago in a riding accident, and folks said he hadn't smiled since. His world had shrunk to chores, cattle, and silence. But Emily had a way of softening the edges without even trying. She'd hum while cooking breakfast, laugh at small things like the ranch dog chasing tumbleweed, and sometimes, when Daniel walked into the room, she'd greet him with a warmth that felt like sunrise after a long night. At first, he didn't know how to take it. But the truth was, her presence stirred something in him he thought he'd buried with his past. One evening, after the men had gone to bed, Daniel found Emily sitting by the corral, watching the horses under a fading moon. She looked peaceful, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. He asked what brought her out here, and she told him the truth, that she'd lost everything. That she wasn't running from anyone, just from the emptiness of what used to be home. Daniel listened, his hat in his hands, and said softly, "Sometimes the West gives back what it takes away. You just gotta stay long enough to see it." Something changed between them that night. Not in words or gestures, but in the way they looked at each other after. Daniel started finding reasons to check on her work, to ask how she was doing. She noticed the way he'd linger by the kitchen door in the mornings, pretending to need coffee just to hear her voice. Slowly, the quiet ranch began to feel alive again. One afternoon, a storm rolled in without warning. Dark clouds swallowed the sun, and the wind howled like a warning from the mountains. Daniel rode out to bring in the cattle before the rain hit, but one of the younger hands was missing, Tommy, a boy barely 18 who'd gone to fix a broken fence on the ridge. Emily watched from the porch, her heart tight, as the wind grew fierce. When Daniel realized Tommy hadn't returned, he grabbed his coat and rode back out into the storm. Hours passed. Lightning split the sky. The ranch hands waited anxiously by the barn, and Emily couldn't stand it anymore. She grabbed a lantern and rode out after him, rain slicing through the dark. She didn't know the land well, but she knew fear, and she wasn't about to let him face it alone. When she finally spotted movement through the sheets of rain, her breath caught. Daniel was helping Tommy back onto his horse, the boy shaking from cold. The three of them barely made it back before the storm broke fully. Once inside the barn, thunder roared above like the heavens themselves were angry, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel turned to her soaked, shivering, his voice rough but gentle, and said, "You shouldn't have come out here." She met his gaze, lantern light flickering between them, and said softly, "You shouldn't have gone alone." For the first time in years, Daniel smiled. Not out of humor, but gratitude. A quiet thank you from a man who had forgotten what it meant to be cared for. After that night, something unspoken grew between them. Emily found herself waiting for him to come back from the fields. Daniel began leaving small things for her: a wildflower on the kitchen table, a blanket folded neatly over her chair. They didn't talk about it, but the ranch hands noticed. The boss had changed. The silence that once hung heavy over the land had turned gentle, like the calm before dawn. Yet, as the days turned warmer, Emily knew her time there was supposed to be temporary. She'd planned to leave once she saved enough to start again somewhere else. But every sunrise on that ranch made it harder to imagine walking away. The summer heat deepened across the Texas plains, turning the air thick with the scent of dry earth and wild sage. Days passed slow under that relentless sun, but for Daniel and Emily, time felt gentler somehow. What began as simple glances had turned into a quiet rhythm between them, a language spoken without words. He'd ride back from the far pasture, and she'd be there on the porch, waiting with a jug of cold water and that small smile that said more than either of them dared to admit. Sometimes in the evenings, they'd sit by the corral watching the sky turn to fire. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding. Daniel had been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what companionship felt like. Emily brought that back without trying, simply by being there, steady and kind. The ranch hands began to joke softly among themselves that Miss Dawson was working more miracles than rain. Even the old mare that hadn't let anyone near her for months now took oats from Emily's hand. But love, even the quiet kind, doesn't come without its reckonings. One morning, a letter arrived from Fort Worth, addressed to Emily. She read it behind the barn, her hands trembling as her eyes scanned the page. It was from a cousin she hadn't heard from in years, offering her a job at a general store in town. Better pay, easier work, a chance at stability. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her pocket, and tried to carry on as if her heart wasn't twisting inside her chest. That afternoon, Daniel found her by the creek, washing linens in the shallow water. He told her the herd was moving slow, and they'd need help mending the fence on the north side. She nodded, but her voice was distant. He noticed, but said nothing. Daniel had lost too much in life to press words out of someone not ready to speak. Still, something in his gut told him the wind was shifting. The following days, Emily worked harder than usual, as if trying to bury the decision she knew she'd have to make. Every time she caught Daniel's gaze, she saw everything she wanted: a home, a place to belong, a man whose strength came from quiet goodness. But she also saw the ghosts that followed him, the memories of a wife gone too soon. She wasn't sure if his heart had room for someone new, or if it was still bound to what he'd lost. Then came the fire. It started in the far field, where the grass was bone-dry and the wind cruel. One spark from a broken lantern, and the flames spread fast. By the time they saw the smoke, it was already roaring toward the barn. Daniel and the men saddled up and rode hard to cut it off, their shouts lost beneath the crackle and roar. Emily ran for the water barrels, forming a line with the younger hands, her dress catching ash as the wind whipped through the yard. Daniel was out front, fighting the fire like a man possessed. Smoke burned his eyes, but he wouldn't stop, not while the horses were still trapped in the lower pens. He broke the gate open, coughing, waving them free, but a beam gave way behind him. The crash was thunderous, and for one terrible moment, Emily couldn't see him through the smoke. She didn't think, she just ran. Through the heat, the sparks, the chaos, she found him on one knee, trying to stand, his face streaked with soot. She helped him up, arm over her shoulder, dragging him away just as the barn roof collapsed behind them in a storm of embers. They stumbled to the water trough, gasping for breath. Daniel's hand gripped hers hard, grounding himself in the only thing that felt real at that moment, her touch. When the flames finally died and dawn crept over the horizon, the ranch was half gone, but the people had survived. The horses were safe, the men were exhausted, and Daniel's arm was burned bad enough to keep him from working for days. Emily stayed by his side, bandaging his wounds, feeding him when he couldn't lift his spoon. For a man like Daniel Carter, accepting help was harder than fighting fire. But Emily wouldn't leave him alone to his pride. As he healed, they spent long evenings on the porch, the smell of charred wood still lingering in the air. The ranch that had once seemed so strong now felt fragile, just like him. One night, as the cicadas hummed and the moon rose pale and full, Daniel spoke softly, his voice rough. He told her about the night his wife passed, about the guilt that had chased him ever since. How he'd sworn never to open his heart again, because every time he did, life seemed to take it away. Emily didn't say much in reply. She just listened, her hand resting gently on his. When he finally fell silent, she said something that stayed with him for the rest of his days. She told him that love wasn't a promise to never lose, it was the courage to give again, even knowing you might. That some hearts were made not to forget, but to keep loving despite it all. For the first time in years, Daniel looked at someone and didn't feel haunted. He felt alive. But as the ranch slowly recovered, Emily grew quiet again. The letter from Fort Worth burned a hole in her pocket, a reminder that her time here was never meant to be forever. One morning before dawn, she packed her bag. She left a note on the kitchen table, just as she'd once done back home, and walked down the long dirt road toward the station. The horizon was pink with sunrise, the same color as the promise she'd found on that ranch. Daniel woke to the sound of the ranch dog barking, but the house was still. When he found her note, his hands shook. It wasn't long, just a few words written in her soft handwriting. She thanked him for the work, the kindness, and for reminding her what home could feel like. She said she had to go, but she'd never forget the ranch or him. He stood there for a long time, staring out at the empty fields, the same land that had taken so much from him. And for a moment, he thought maybe it had taken too much again. But then he remembered her words, that love was the courage to give again. And he realized, maybe this time, he wasn't meant to let it go so easily. He saddled his horse, the morning light cutting through the mist, and rode hard toward the station. The train station sat on the edge of Red Bluff, where the prairie met the rails and the world seemed to split between what was left behind and what lay ahead. Emily stood on the worn platform, her bag by her feet, the wind tugging at her hair as the morning sun crept higher. Around her, strangers murmured, luggage clattered, and the whistle of the waiting train echoed through the open air. She told herself she was doing the right thing, chasing something steady, something certain. But deep down, her heart wasn't convinced. Every breath tasted like goodbye. She watched the horizon one last time, hoping for a reason to stay, though she didn't expect one to come. The man she'd come to care for was tied to his land, his past, his loss. She was just a helping hand, a wanderer passing through. That's what she told herself as she gripped the ticket tighter in her palm, the edges soft from worry. Then she heard it. The distant thundering of hooves, faint at first, but growing louder, faster. Folks turned their heads toward the road leading from the east. Through the rising dust, a rider came into view, bent low in the saddle, coat flapping, horse lathered, and wild-eyed. For a heartbeat, Emily thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But as he drew closer, she saw him clearly. Daniel Carter, the man she had tried not to love, riding like the wind itself wouldn't dare stand in his way. He reined in hard by the platform, breathless, dust swirling around him. His horse snorted and stomped, chest heaving from the run. Daniel swung down, boots striking the dirt, and for a long moment, they just stood there, neither speaking, the world shrinking to the space between them. He was still streaked with ash from the fire, his arm wrapped in bandages, but his eyes held that steady, unflinching warmth, the kind of look that made you believe the West could still be kind. Emily's heart pounded. She wanted to run to him, but she stayed still, afraid the moment might vanish if she moved. The train whistle blew again, long and lonely, cutting through the silence. Daniel stepped closer, and the weight of all the unsaid things hung between them like smoke after rain. He didn't beg or ask or try to hold her back with promises. He simply looked at her the way a man does when he's found what he didn't know he was missing. That look said more than words ever could. It said she belonged, not because he needed saving, but because she had saved him without even trying. Emily felt something inside her finally rest, like the dust settling after a long ride home. The train began to move, wheels clinking slow at first. She looked at the cars passing by, then back at Daniel, at the man who had taught her that broken things could still be mended. She let the ticket slip from her hand, carried away by the wind, and stepped toward him. By the time the train disappeared down the line, she was in his arms, the world quiet again. Around them, the prairies stretched wide and endless, and for the first time in a long while, both of them felt like they had found where they were meant to be. The days that followed weren't easy, but they were theirs. Together they rebuilt what the fire had taken. Daniel's arm healed, though it bore a scar that would forever remind him of that night, and of the woman who had run into the flames for him. Emily learned the rhythm of ranch life, not as a worker anymore, but as part of it. She rode beside him in the fields, helped brand calves in the spring, and laughed with the men around the campfire when the work was done. The ranch began to thrive again, grass returning greener than before, as if the land itself had been waiting for love to take root once more. In town, folks started whispering about Daniel Carter, the man who'd found peace after years of silence. They said Miss Dawson had a light about her, the kind that could turn a lonely house into a home. No one questioned how it happened, because some things in the West just made sense when you saw them. Seasons rolled on. The air turned crisp, the sky painted in shades of amber and gold. On quiet evenings, Daniel and Emily would sit on the porch, her head resting on his shoulder, watching the sun dip behind the hills. Sometimes, he'd point to the horizon and tell her how he used to think that's where the world ended. Now, he said, it was where everything began. Years later, when travelers passed by the Carter Ranch, they'd often see them still there, an older man and woman sitting side by side as the light faded, their hands intertwined, their laughter carried by the wind. The kind of love that didn't need to be spoken, because it was etched into the land itself. And if you stood there long enough, you could almost hear the echoes of how it all began. A lost woman stepping off a dusty bus, a broken man riding home from the fields, two hearts that had every reason to stay closed, and yet somehow, against the odds, found each other beneath that wide Texas sky. Because some loves aren't about where you're headed, but about who you find along the way. And out there in the West, where the sunsets burn red and the nights are long, love doesn't always come easy, but when it does, it stays. Like the land. Like the promise of rain. Like a cowboy who changed everything.